On this episode of Sustainable Horizons.
When scientists are freaking out, this is why.
The collapse of our ocean currents. I don't think we understand fully how impactful they are.
A lot of the media historically has been, we're all going to die, the world's on fire.
Guess what?
What?
We're back.
So sick.
I know, I'm excited. This episode's going to get me heated.
Pun intended?
Pun intended.
Get it? Because we're talking about global warming. And more specifically, that January 2024 marked the first time that the global average surface temperature exceeded 1.5 degrees Celsius, which anyone tracking global warming in that whole case, that's a pretty big number, during a 12-month period, according to the Copernicus Climate Change Service. For the 1.5 degrees Celsius climate threshold, the average time range is defined as the pre-industrial period, or the period time before the increase in atmospheric greenhouse gases due to human emissions that began to significantly influence global temperatures. This time period typically refers to about 1850 to 1900. So that's about when all the factories and all that industrial stuff started happening. Pretty big change. Why was that such a big change? So I feel like whenever you get into talking about climate change with people, you always get someone to be like, the Earth has warmed multiple times before, it'll be fine. Well, we got some data, thanks to our good friends at NASA. They sent this to us personally. So just in the last 800,000 years, there have been 8 cycles of ice ages and warming periods, global warmings, with the end of the last age being about 11,700 years ago, marking the beginning of the modern climate era, also known as human civilization. So over these last 800,000 years, carbon dioxide levels expressed in parts per million have consistently ranged between about 180 parts per million to 300 parts per million. And so, again, at the end of the last ice age, which was 11,700 years ago, we were sitting at about 180 parts per million. And by about 1850, we were at 280. Normal. This was in the normal range. But again, 1850 was the start of the Industrial Revolution.
So basically, during this whole period in time, it was just natural things raising it. So like thinking volcanoes, wildfires just happening or occurring naturally.
It's also the cycle of the Earth's orbit and how it will get a little closer to the sun and a little farther away from the sun. That's another really common, one of the primary drivers of the changing of the amount of carbon dioxide, which again is basically the fuel to the fire that is global warming. So 1850, we were at 280, again, normal. By 1911, we were at 300, which is historically the highest point that we get. This is where it starts speeding up. By 1950, 360, and today we're at 420 parts per million. So when scientists are freaking out, this is why. Is because if you've ever taken a biology class, you've heard of the term homeostasis, meaning things liking to stay in this kind of medium range of comfortability. We have far overshot that homeostasis, being at 420 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. This ancient or paleoclimate evidence reveals that current warming is occurring roughly 10 times faster than the average rate of warming after an ice age. Additionally, carbon dioxide from human activities is increasing about 250 times faster than it did from natural resources after the last ice age. So this is concerning.
250 times faster.
250 times. We dug all this oil-based matter, carbon-based matter. We've just been burning it on up. Or said you fucked around, you're about to find out.
So this happened in January of this year. Well, I guess of this podcast recording, 2024, January 2024. I didn't know until a coworker told me. As a person who's in sustainability and environmentalists, granted, I'm not the best at keeping up on sustainability news, but I figured this type of news was not necessarily sustainability news. You know, like this didn't warrant a special search to find. This should have been breaking headlines considering how often climate is in media today. But this one didn't come across my feeds. And so when they said that to me, I was a little shocked, and I looked it up and I went, sure enough, here it is. And I just took some time to kind of process. And one of my main questions was like, well, why is nobody really talking about this? So I dug in a little further, and I knew we were in an El Niño year, but I dove into what does that mean? And like, why is that important to this conversation? Because that kept coming up in all these articles I was reading. So they started noting the potential for a strong El Niño way back in April of 2023. So almost a year ago now. El Niños arrive or happen in June. So they were forecasting 3 or 4 months ahead of time that this was going to be a bad one, partly due to changes in our climate from global warming and things like that. But forecasters estimated that there was a 55% chance that the El Niño will remain above this threshold for a strong push through January to March 2024. So around that time is when it was supposed to end. We here in Minnesota have definitely seen that. This has been the least snowiest winter I have ever experienced here, and definitely record-setting highs regularly on a daily basis here.
Real quick, I was looking into this earlier. On average, Minnesota has 30 to 80 inches of snow.
That's crazy.
With an average of about 50.
We've had maybe 2.
This year, we've only had 14.2 inches. So by far the least snowy year. It's been a brown winter almost year round. I think we've maybe had 2 weeks with actual snow cover.
Right.
If that.
Yeah, there was like 2 snowstorms.
Mm-hmm.
And they did not drop a lot, clearly.
And they did not stay.
No. I do remember that there was a big one that dropped like 5, 6, 7 inches. And that was it. And then there's been a little bit of dustings, and then one other kind of more major one. So that makes sense. 14 inches, but on average, we're supposed to get 50. So this El Niño has been very strong, and we've seen it here and across the U.S. There has been indications of similar outcomes from this. So this past 12-month period to which we have seen the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold being passed was plagued by 6 months of a strong El Niño, driving winter temperatures way up, leading to that passing. So there's some disagreement on exactly what counts as a breaching of this threshold. For this reason, there are anomalies like the El Niño that we have seen that have pushed its past. So both scientists and policymakers agree that it has to be a multi-year average and not just a 12-month period. Now, this is a great thing about science is like there are always these anomalies and you kind of have to prove it time and time again. Correct me if I'm wrong, but is it not a theory if it can be repeated 3 times or something like that?
I've not heard that.
It's something with like
in either direction.
Yeah, well, it's something like experimentation. Like if it can be done once, cool. If it's done twice, like coincidence. And like the 3rd time, you can prove that something is happening. And the same case is here. You know, you can't just prove like, okay, 12 months, we've crossed that threshold and we're never going back kind of deal. That's just not what's going to happen. Next year, we're not going to be in an El Niño and we're going to go back down. Scientists actually think that this official breaching and maintaining above this 1.5 degree Celsius threshold is going to happen sometime in the 2030s. So we got about hopefully 6 to 10 years for this point to be crossed. I made a funny joke. No, let's hope it doesn't advance like AI is, because that's been crazy. How fast this shit has been going. I've decided the point. They also think it's really realistic that there will be another 12-month threshold breach before that 2030 mark when we are at the point of no return on this 1.5 degree Celsius increase. There will likely be another breach of the 12-month period. El Niños and La Niñas, they come in 4-year cycles on average. So this makes sense because in 4 years from now, we're probably going to be 2029 breaching it again. And people are going to freak out a little bit more because we're further along in our climate journey. But hopefully we can make some great progress in the next 4 years.
And this is also a great time to talk to your point of we want this to be a multi-year average. From what I was reading, it was they sometimes like to be like a decade-long average because there are these differences between weather events and general global climate issues. Weather events contribute, but we want the cumulative total.
It needs to be kind of like a systematic change, right? Like there is no going back. That's not just a bad storm, you know, that's kind of causing all this change. One thing I'd like to point out, I think as we're talking about this is the Paris Agreement set a goal of not exceeding 2 degrees Celsius. I think another reason we're not really hearing a big like whoopla or outcry from this 1.5 degree breaching is because we've never really had a strong goal towards achieving or staying under this. The Paris Agreements and most nations said that they would pursue efforts to keep it below 1.5 degrees Celsius.
Which means nothing.
Coming from governments, yes, it does mean nothing.
Yeah.
So there's never been this goal to keep it under. We as environmentalists and activists hope to keep it under. So most scientists think that we're going to breach this 1.5 degree threshold inevitably. It's just going to happen. Why? Because our economy is too stuck on fossil fuels to transition fast enough to actually achieve that goal. And it's important to note that like our last episode we recorded, we talked about electrification and how clean energy has been rising at a lot faster rate because it's so cheap. So in a few years or next year even, I'd be curious to see how people's thoughts are on this and what our renewable energy journey is. Because that's a huge part of this, is if we can electrify everything and kind of get away from the fossil fuels, this goal becomes a lot more achievable. So the pace at which that advances is the pace at which we can maybe achieve that goal. But it's never really been something that we think that has been achievable, or scientists have not believed it to be achievable. So this 2 degree is kind of the point that we're really shooting for. The only difference is between hoping for the 1.5 and the 2 is hoping that in that difference, that 0.5 degree Celsius difference, we don't hit any catastrophic tipping points. This is something I also think is kind of underwhelmingly talked about for good reason, because I think it is also a kind of doomsday approach to talking about this, and that is not always the best in instilling hope and hope for a better future, I guess.
I think it turns people off often more than it.
Yeah. Sustainability already has the ick surrounding it, right? Nobody wants to talk about it.
Oh, I want to put that on a t-shirt.
And I think we have a duty to talk about it, but also make sure that we're instilling hope, and no hope gets you nowhere. No change. But what are catastrophic tipping points? These are considered nonlinear changes that happen when a system is pushed past a threshold beyond which change becomes self-sustaining. This means that even if the original pressure eases off, the change would keep going until the system reaches sometimes a completely different state. So when we're thinking of this, I think one thing that is really scary, but is kind of super abstract and doesn't really mean anything to anybody, is the collapse of our ocean currents. I don't think we understand fully how impactful they are because they create the trade winds. They move warm water to cool water. They move around nutrients and air and all these different things. But if we get to a point where one of those current collapses because it's a really warm year or whatever happens, it's just not going to come back until we hit the next ice age or something else happens. Like that current is gone, and therefore our weather patterns are forever changed after the fact.
So a great example of one of these is right now, one of the reasons the South Pole remains so cold is it has a wind and water current pattern that it essentially just circulates the entire island. And so it traps all that cold air and water and ice where it is. But as the other patterns are warming and changing, this could be impacted too, which means a warming of the South Pole.
And in the North Pole, we already have issues. One of the biggest ones is the collapse of the Greenland ice sheet. When that happens, it's going to be a domino effect for some of these other ones. So like the collapse of the ocean currents likely happening after the collapse of the Greenland ice sheet.
And real quick, people, she said Greenland, as in it's on land. There's a lot of people who are like, well, who cares about melting glaciers? Sea levels won't rise. It's already in the water. It's on the land. The ice sheets are also on the land.
Yeah. This is very bad.
And then it'll be in the ocean, and ocean will go up.
Yeah, a lot of our ice sheets actually are on the land. There's a lot in the water as well, but like under Antarctica is a plot of land. So it may just look like a lot of ice just floating there. It's not. It's attached to something. So when that eventually goes, yeah, even more sea level rising. And without this ice sheet, you're going to have permafrost thawing. And that's happening in Russia and different things. And I feel like we've seen some reports of the random bugs that are coming back alive or that they've been frozen in this permafrost kind of in a perfect state. And then when thawed, it's like nothing's changed. It hasn't aged. It hasn't done anything. So some of these bacterias and fungi and different things have been coming out of it. So there's a plethora of reasons why we don't want certain systems to collapse. And as we progress in this warming and we reach the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold and we breach it and we maintain that, and that becomes a systematic thing, these tipping thresholds become a little bit more serious and dangerous to our way of life, basically.
I also want to talk about some of this doomsday stuff because I think a lot of the media historically has been, we're all going to die, the world's on fire, we're screwed. And so people hear about global warming, they're like, we're not going to die, like, we're fine, humans are resilient, we'll be okay. And that may be true. Humans may be fine. In past global warming periods, though, it's not just that we're getting warmer, it's the rate at which we're getting warmer. Because animals, hitting on evolution now, so we're hitting all the hot button topics. Animals evolve to match the climate that they're in, or they have to migrate to match the climate that they're in. Sometimes that's humans. We can migrate quite easily, especially with modern day technology, but it's also things like trees. Mountains operate as really interesting climate change models for scientists to study biology. So on each rung, they're able to map out zones on mountains where certain species of trees and animals and other sorts of plants, and they have already tracked that as it has gotten warmer, trees have been migrating up this mountain. The ones that were previously at the bottom are now in the middle. The problem is there's only so much space to go up. And once it reaches the top, it just dies. And that means us losing significant biodiversity as that happens, because not everything can just pick up and move. So while it may be true that humans are maybe relatively okay, you also have to talk about changing weather patterns. So we just talked about the lack of snow here in Minnesota, which means that farmers are going to have dry fields come springtime. We like to eat food. That's kind of important. Yeah, so that's going to be a big impact. A lot of aquatic life, which is another big carbon sink, which we've talked a lot about. Animals that live, the corals that are there, are going to die because they cannot adapt to the increase in heat and also the increase in acidity that comes from an increased amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere.
It gets crowded in the ideal places, and you'll see that with humans too, right? I think we have 5 or 6 cities identified across the world that are kind of immune to climate change.
Duluth is one of them.
And Duluth, Minnesota is one of them, yeah. Because we have large bodies of fresh water, so that's always a resource. And we're not by an ocean, so we're not going to be drowned out. And besides really shitty winters, like we can kind of handle the swings. Like the land is capable of the extreme colds and the extreme hots because that's what we're used to already. So the plants and animals here are more adapted to those types of things. Now there's extremes, of course, and that's going to affect everybody, even us humans. But I think going back to the mountain case study, we see that, it gets crowded towards the top of the mountain in this ideal climate where everybody's like trying to be cooler and maybe a little bit drier than the base, because the base is now maybe hot and wet. And that's just not what these trees and animals are used to, or plants and animals are used to. So it's getting crowded at the top of the mountain, but it's going to get crowded in these cities too, or these zones that are deemed climate resilient cities. So it'll affect us too. And you'll see these floods of people migrating from the coastal regions. They're super pretty now, but people in Florida have a tough time finding insurance now, especially flood insurance. The one thing you need because you know it's going to flood, or you're going to have a hurricane, or that type of stuff. It just becomes unaffordable and you have to move.
Yeah.
And so you go to the boring old Midwest because it's safe.
That just made me remember a Ben Shapiro meme where he's like, well, if you're so afraid of flooding, just sell your home on the coast. And then the meme as it cuts to a guy banging through the wall. Sell the homes to who? Aquaman?
Yeah. Yeah. That's true. Yeah, no, it's going to become hard for cities like Miami to recoup any type of money out of it. Like, just stop investing in that city because, like, 10 years from now, you have no idea where it's going to stand. It could be Venice. To build canals in the streets instead.
Venice is already about to be wiped off the map.
Better go see it before you can't. Or before it becomes the lost city of Atlantis. Maybe that was a prediction and not lost city, actually.
What if the lost city of Atlantis was the friends we made along the way? Never mind.
You may have no idea, right? All right. I guess to wrap it all up, we breached the threshold of 1.5 degrees Celsius in January of 2024. It's not as serious as it may sound, and that's why there's not been a lot of uproar around it on social media, the news, different things like that. There's just like a lot of different things that go into deciding when that threshold is breached. And could it be a decade's worth of data, or is it 3 years worth of data? That's something I can't say. I'm going to leave that one in the scientists' hands, but know that we've breached it, and likely this year we will go back to normal as this El Niño passes. And the hope is that we can push it off to 2040. We can progress so fast in our clean energy and electrification efforts in third world countries as well, because that's where it's going to be the biggest impact, and that this technology just gets cheaper and we find a better way of living that we can avoid this for as long as possible.
That's all we got for today.
Until next time.